All right, guys, what's going on? Welcome back to Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nick here, we're looking at the LSU Tigers, and are they an underrated national championship favorite in college football in 2025? Of course, this is just the wee hours of the offseason here in late January, but LSU is already building tons of momentum with key returnees and a phenomenal portal class that I would grade out as number one at the moment. On screen right now are the topics we're going to discuss today regarding LSU. Of course, we're going to start with Garrett Nussmeier at quarterback. Is this guy capable of leading them to a deep CFP run? I think that's going to be the biggest question mark right now. This is a guy who at times looked really good last year, but I think for the most part, maybe fell short of expectations. I mean, he still had over 4,000 passing yards, 30-plus touchdowns. He did have those 12 interceptions, though, Nick. I was watching some tape on him. Some of the interceptions weren't all that bad, but for the most part, they weren't great. This is a guy who can certainly throw way too many lofting balls downfield instead of firing on a fine line. The vision got really poor. Mentally, I noticed he seems to kind of get lazy with diagnosing coverage and sometimes can force things that aren't there, leading to his interceptions. That's what I noticed in the Texas A&M game, is he just kind of gets lazy, with where guys on defense might be, and totally forgets that they're, potentially in position to make a play without seeing them and diagnosing them. And I think that's one thing he's going to, work on tremendously this offseason. I do want to give him a little bit of slack. This is a guy who threw 40 times a game this past season of a pretty weak run game, Nick. That's not ideal for what ended up being a first-year starter. He does have some solid experience coming into last year, but he still was a first-year starter at the end of the day. Throwing that many times per contest is not ideal. Those things I noticed on tape in terms of negatives certainly weren't pretty, and I expect them to be fixed.
There were certainly some highs and some lows for Garrett Nussmeier this past season. 525 attempts is certainly no joke. This is a guy with a high football IQ, which is why some of that concerning film, is concerning, right? This is a guy that comes from a football family. His dad, Doug Nussmeier, obviously was previously an offensive coordinator at multiple stops in college football at Washington, Michigan, Florida, then Alabama under Nick Saban, and is currently the quarterback's coach for the Super Bowl bound, at the time of recording this, Philadelphia Eagles, who just won the NFC Championship game a couple of days prior to recording this. When you look at him, right, Nussmeier, he is a very talented player with a lot of attempts, about 64% comp rate, 4,000 yards passing, and 29 touchdowns. The 12 picks is concerning. There were times where he threw balls into situations, like you said, that were just bad situations to throw, lapses in judgments, really looking complacent in the pocket and making mistakes. He made mistakes against Alabama. He made mistakes in some of their other games. Some of the other key losses, made mistakes against USC as well in the opener in Vegas, and just looked a little bit shaky, a little uncomfortable at times. Now, there's a large sample size here to work with, obviously, so you're highlighting. And ultimately, his interception rate was about 2.3% on the season with a 5.5% touchdown rate. So solid numbers there in terms of touchdown rate to interception rate at 2%. Obviously like a little bit lower, I think, but still not a terrible number. This is a guy that's going to get another offseason of learning the system. I think he's a very talented quarterback. I think the frame on him is really good, and the arm strength is solid as well. All the things that we highlighted in previous years, 6'2", 200 pounds, very accurate with the 64% comp rate, so a solid player in that regard. I think giving him another year to work with the playbook, learn, and continue to grow the supporting cast, I think it's a little bit better this upcoming season as well. The lack of a run game certainly did not help LSU at all in some of those key games, and we worried about that in the preseason. We wondered what the running game would look like for the Tigers in 2024, and it was disappointing to say the least. So getting a more stable run game in 2025 could certainly help out this younger quarterback who's continuing to develop and turn into a star. But I have full faith in him that he's able to step forward and take that next step, cut down on the turnovers, get a little bit more accurate, and he could have a really great season. I expect at least 4,000 yards passing again. I think he could break that 30 touchdown mark this year.
The positives for him are outstanding. He throws with some legit heat, a big-time arm, has gunslinger-like mentality, for the most part has good ball placement, navigates the pocket pretty well, and his arm doesn't waver on the run at all. It wasn't great for him in terms of play calling at times either. Remember the Ole Miss game where he ended up completing 43%. They were just calling go ball after go route, and he just had to continue to throw it away because no one was open. That's a tough D-line they were facing as well, and again, no run game. So things need to certainly tighten up around him for him to certainly continue to flourish and showcase his full potential. And kind of the next thing we'll look at here is, the supporting cast. They're pretty lethal. The confidence in the offensive line, though, we're going to discuss that as well as we move to our second slide with the projected starting offense. A lot of transfers here. A lot of very good transfers, though, as well. combined with nice returnees. You start with my favorite one here, Nick Anderson. Didn't play last year at Oklahoma due to injury. As a freshman 2 years ago, though, he was a walking big play. 10 touchdowns, 21 yards per catch. This guy, for example, had 3 receptions, all 3 of them being scores in the game against Tulsa. He generated great depth on his routes. He just blows by defenders out wide. Great suddenness from him. I'm a big fan of Nick Anderson. It's unfortunate he was unable to play last year, but this is a much better situation for him, I would say. And you look around him, the talent doesn't end there at all. I mean, you have guys like Barian Brown, a complete speedster. Needs to continue to work on his route running, though. This is a guy who has, great opportunities on, screens and special teams. Elite speed. I love the acceleration. 15 drops in 3 years, though. Never really been a great route runner. I know a lot of people like to criticize Zachariah Branch, but him and Barian Brown are very similar players. Incredibly explosive, but in the other areas, they don't really check the box, and they need to work on those and improve. I think he'll be a great addition for this team in some capacity. Aaron Anderson, I thought he'd be great. The former Alabama transfer was finally thrust into action this year, and he was great. He made some big-time plays for them throughout the season. You've seen Chris Hilton get on the field in the bowl game, showcasing his speed. Xavier Thomas, a bit of a Swiss Army knife, and I know a lot of fans and coaches are high on Kyle Parker as well. This is a team that has plenty of options, Nick. Of course, they have a nice tight end room. Bauer Sharp, Donovan Green joined the party from the portal. Trey Green, he looked good in the bowl game. Great height, nice athletic ability from him. So this is a complete supporting cast. We'll talk about the run game here in a second, but in terms of these weapons here for Nussmeier, this should be, bombs away for him, and he should have a great year.
Yeah, I like some of the weapons here. I think Anderson, top returning receiver for this team, top receiver last year for LSU, 885 receiving, 14.5 yards to grab, and 5 scores. I think he's a really solid number 1 to target in the slot. Really shifty, nice route tree, a really solid player. Brown, coming over from Kentucky, I think it was a good ad, right? 539 yards this past season and 4 touchdowns for the Wildcats. He comes over here. I think he's a talented player. You can play him at the Z, move him around a little bit. Him and Nick Anderson could potentially flip between the Z and the X position here, but I think those are 2 solid players that could really step up and play good football for this team. Good ads, in my opinion. I think Xavier Thomas, we're kind of waiting for him to break out, but he still had 23 grabs, about 218 yards, and 2 scores this year. So that could be someone you want to look at in the future. I think Kyle Parker, I think they plan to reserve his red shirt this past season. Only played in 4 games, but he had a couple grabs, including a touchdown. So solid potential with him. And then the tight end room also has some solid players. And Trey Green, who's a solid piece, that had a couple grabs, including 4 touchdowns this past season. So I think he's a guy that you could see get involved in this offense. I think this is a solid starting rotation here, a really solid unit with some guys that have experience at other SEC programs in Oklahoma and Kentucky, some players that have played at the program now that have experience in previous SEC programs, and some guys that are a bit younger that are going to get involved in the offense. I think there's some high upside here, certainly with this LSU passing group.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be the deadliest group, I think, in the country in terms of just raw speed. I mean, it is across the board unreal. So many different guys you have to worry about here. And I think the creativity this offseason needs to be put to test to get everybody involved in, whatever role suits them best. And even Bauer Sharp's a bit of a Swiss Army knife in his own right as well. So, I mean, in terms of weapons, everything here checks out, and that's why I think Nussmeier is the Heisman favorite, even though he did have some weaknesses last year, and I fully understand why. And now you look at the offensive line in the run game, though, because this really needs to come around. The O-line, I thought coming into the year was the nation's best, and they ended the year first or second. Denver, Texas was really a toss-up. Now you replace a lot of those guys. The only one that returns is a former 5-star DJ Chester at right guard. He was probably more so the weak link for them, but he was still great in pass protection. He's really going to emerge, I think, as a leader for them. This is a guy who played at center. He wasn't great as a run blocker. Looks like he's going to kick out the right guard now as Braylon Moore makes his way over from Virginia Tech. He's a guy who started each of the last 2 seasons. He's been a really good player for them in pass protection. Does have versatility to play at either of the guard spots as well. You also pick up a guy in Josh Thompson, likely going to slot in at that left guard spot. So I think they're pretty confident in their interior. But when you look at the tackles, what are you going to get from Tyree Adams and Weston Davis, 2 incredibly young players? It's certainly probably not going to be what you had in Will Campbell and then at right tackle as well.
I think this is an offensive line that has some solid pieces, more coming over from Virginia Tech. Hopefully going to slot him at center. He's a big physical offensive line piece that I think adds a lot. And then Josh Thompson from Northwestern, a guy that's got a good experience playing at that level, 6'5", 300 pounds. Obviously, he's a big, solid piece at left guard that I think could really step up. DJ Chester, we've seen him, grow so far, but he still has a lot more work to do at right guard. I think he's a talented player. And then you really do worry about the 2 tackles with Adams and Davis. Those are the guys that are 2 players that have the least amount of experience so far. more. I think Adams could be really solid. I think Davis could be solid as well. But I worry about that right side when you look at Chester and Davis there. You wonder if those two could play together and play strong football. Maybe you try to flip something around, move Chester to the other side potentially. I don't know exactly if they want to put Thompson out of place at left guard. I think DJ Tester's a really talented player who will continue to develop and grow in this system and improve his pass block and his run block. I'm worried about the tackles a little bit. I think the interior is definitely a strong unit here. This just does have an offensive line potential to grow and develop. I think this can still be a great unit in college football and certainly a great unit in the SEC. Got to protect Nussmeier, give him some time, give him a clean pocket here, give him an opportunity to throw the ball, and also help out your run game, right? We need to see this run game improve for LSU if they want to take that next step and reach the college football playoff. They got to find a way to be more efficient on the ground because this past season it just wasn't good enough. And I think it was certainly a young unit, but when you look at the rushing attack, 116 yards per game and about 1 touchdown per game, it's just not good enough for this offense. They got to find a way to be more effective on the ground. We're going to highlight that in a second here.
Yeah, you look at a lead back in Caden Durham. I thought he was very impressive. He really willed this team at times as a runner throughout the season. Ended the year with 753 and 6 scores. And then other than that, it wasn't much from this backfield. Caleb Jackson was disappointing. Xavier Thomas at times got carries. At one point, they had great depth at running back, and that's just not the case anymore. And that's not going to change this year. But Durham, I think, can certainly be the guy that takes this lead in the backfield and be, a bit of a workhorse in both regards as a pass catcher and a runner as well.
Yeah, I worry about this backfield. I think Durham is a great leader, but outside of him, the depth is a little bit shaky. Caleb Jackson wants to have a better season. He did not have a great season this past year. 150 yards for him, 3.4 yards per carry for the junior. Just did not have a great season. Durham, I think, is a really talented back. Right, we saw him exceed at times. We saw him look good. Some of the steps, some of the move he has are solid. Some of the footwork is good on him. 753 and 6 scores, like you said, about 62 yards per game. Also, 28 grabs out of the backfield, including 2 touchdowns. So expect him to get involved in the passing attack from Nussmeier this year as well. Another year of him to gain experience, right? Playing as a true freshman obviously was tough for him. He returns hoping to have another solid season here. I think this is a guy that you can rely on as your number one, but the depth does worry me, right? This is a weak backfield. They don't have a whole lot of depth. I think that's something that's continuing to bite them. I was wondering if they're going to go in the portal and try and grab a back or two, just try and strengthen this backfield a little bit. They lose Josh Williams, who is a graduate senior, so he's no longer going to be around. I wonder if they can find a way to beef up this backfield just a little bit more, because I don't know if I trust Durham carrying the load fully. I'd like to see him have some help back there.
Now you look at an LSU defense. There's certainly been an issue under Brian Kelly, but I think there's certainly a work in progress, and they showcased improvements throughout the year. Certainly not to the greatest of tune, though. First year under Blake Baker looked pretty solid, right? And I think for the most part, this is a team that still has some struggles in certain areas. They're losing their top 2 defensive ends, though. Braden Swinson, Savion Jones, a couple of linebackers depart as well. Harold Perkins, great return there. That was kind of unexpected. He had a bad injury that ended his season, cut it short last year. With Weeks, he also went down in the bowl game. So those are 2 great linebackers there who, are going to miss most of the offseason, it appears. But both of these players are great. Obviously, we see what Perkins has in terms of athletic ability with Weeks. He's a real lunch pail type of guy, really grinds things out. 125 tackles for them. Biggest problem for LSU at times is this run defense just didn't have the people on the interior to really step up, and they didn't do a great job of defending the boundary as well. I mean, they're incredibly exposed to the quarterback run, gave up a lot of big plays outside of the tackles. It's not ideal there. They do add guys like Patrick Payton and Jack Pyburn, Jamari Butler as well. So I think this pass rush will be fine. The only guy they picked up on the interior, though, would be Sadir Mitchell. There's going to be, an interesting group here. Jacobian Gilroy, he's going to be returning. He's a veteran. Dominic McKinley, they're hoping is going to really step up for them. This run defense, it's pretty much going to be the same people they had last year, Nick, and then these transfers are going to replace the outgoing guys. What is your, faith in them improving in this area that is major, and it's really make or break for this defense?
This is a very middle-of-the-road defense, just an average unit. Everything is in like the 50s to 60s nationally, 24 points per game, 59th in the nation, 364 yards per game, 61st, and then run defense, 140 yards per game, 51st, and 61st in total defense, right? Just a very average middle-of-the-road defense. They have to find a way to be better against the run. Giving up that amount of yardage in SEC play, 177 yards to be exact per game, is not good enough, right? This defensive line, I worry about some of the depth. I think they added some good pieces, certainly, and I think Dominic McKinley is a guy that I'm, pegging to certainly step step up and be a key player for this team. Didn't get a whole lot of reps last year, but he's a guy you could potentially rely on. And then Ahmad Burrow as well is a guy that you could potentially look at. He had 17 total tackles and 2 tackles for loss last year. You want to see if he could potentially step up and be involved in this pass rush. They added 2 solid pieces in Jack Pyburn and Patrick Payton on the edges there. There's some other players shown Washington, Jacoby Gilroy, who are hoping to be involved on the interior. I think Gilroy's had potential to step up and be involved on this defensive line. But I worry about this unit, right? This is a unit that has to be better here. They got to be better against the run. They got to be better at clogging the trenches here, because if they don't have a successful season, this LSU team could be in a lot of trouble. Teams were able to run all over them last year, and it certainly proved a problem. We saw Alabama run all over LSU, and what was a key win for Alabama at that moment in time. We saw some other teams have success on the ground against them, like South Carolina. So I think this is an opportunity for them to step up and be a lot stronger this year in that regard.
And this secondary is also going to have to take leaps and bounds. One thing I do want to add is the 4 transfers they picked up on the front 7. I think those guys are all tremendous, and they're certainly going to all have an impact this year. The secondary, though, they were never really bad, but they were really never great either. Zy Alexander, by far, was their best coverage corner, one of the best in the country. He's now going to depart. And again, they were never terrible. Baylor playing from behind, threw the ball a lot, put up numbers in a bit of a meaningless bowl game, I guess you could call it. They looked good against Ole Miss for the most part until late in that game. They started getting carved up, but this was never really a liability for them. Other than the USC game, they really struggled to defend that abundance of talent there. And this is relatively going to be the same group. They do add some transfers, though. Ashton Stamps is a returnee, though. He got picked on a little bit more often than not. Gave up almost 500 yards in coverage. Other than that, not many guys played. It was just him and Alexander out wide. And you look at the guys like Mansour Delane, who come over from Virginia Tech. He's going to be a starting corner. He's been pretty good in his couple of years as a starter. Jakeem Jackson was a former high-end recruit at Florida, never really played. DJ Pickett, though, this is a guy who's going to be inserted probably a lot into the lineup. Top 10 recruit nationally, 5-star from Tampa, Florida. This is a guy that's probably going to have a big impact this year. I think for LSU, they'll certainly benefit by having more of a rotation in their secondary. The safety group was kind of, less than stellar. Deshaun Spears, Jordan Gilbert, these are going to be your 2 main guys, it appears. Gilbert really wasn't that great throughout the season. Him and Sage Ryan rotated in that role. Gilbert, he's going to have to improve, though. I think he was a Texas A&M transfer, while Spears, he looked good in run defense in his minimal snaps, but he also really wasn't much of a factor in coverage. They're going to have to showcase more playmaking skills this year, Nick, and I think at corner they certainly have a big boost in that regard. Only 6 interceptions last year. That's pretty weak. It's certainly going to have to double at least if you want to compete in this conference. They also picked up another guy in Tamarcus Cooley, who's going to be a nickel back for them. So I think they've done a solid job here. They picked up a 5-star and 2 transfers. But the depth isn't, ideal still, I think, for LSU. I think at corner it's better and it's improved and it's encouraging. But I'm not really sure how I feel about this secondary.
Yeah, the secondary has some shaky parts for here. I do think that, Stamps was a decent player at coverage at the time, right? Led the team with 14 pass breakups, 51 total tackles. But there were some weaknesses in his game. No interceptions either. Struggled in that regard. They add Cooley, who previously was at NC State and Maryland, hoping that he can get, regain some of his footing. Delane from Virginia Tech is hoping to be a solid add as well at right corner. You're going to hope he's going to step up. PJ Woodland is also on the depth chart there. He didn't play a whole lot last year. He had 20 total tackles, 2 tackles for loss, and 3 pass breakups. Look at the safeties, right? I think Spears is a decent player, 24 total tackles and a pass breakup, but nothing that really jumps off the screen. And then Gilbert, 55 total tackles, 2 tackles for loss, and 3 pass breakups. I think this is a secondary unit that's got some shaky parts. They're going to have to hopefully be bailed out a little bit by the linebacking core. That's a really solid unit still. I think that's a really great unit that we're going to highlight there. And I think the secondary has some decent pieces, but I'm still a little bit worried about it. This is a team that got picked on through the air occasionally last year. I think teams that are really solid can find a way to do that again this year.
Yeah, and Tamarcus Cooley, more of a natural nickel, had a great year for NC State, will take over that role compared to guys like Burns and Ryan and Gilbert, who kind of rotated that slot position more so true safeties trying to occupy that role. So I think they certainly have more personnel to try and, differentiate what they want to do here in the secondary. I think they'll ultimately be improved overall. This is a team that I think is going to really compete this year. It's a tough schedule. They open the season on the road at Clemson. They play at Alabama. Those are 2 games I know off the top of my head, and that's already going to be difficult to begin with. 9-3, can that get you to the CFP? Depends how you lose those respective games and how those respective opponents do the rest of the season. So I think it's possible at 9-3. That'd be a disappointing year for LSU, though. I think this is a team that should compete in the SEC, should certainly be in the playoffs, but it's going to be tough, Nick. This is a very difficult schedule, but it is, the SEC at the end of the day, and that's what you're going to get. Ultimately, what is your expectation for LSU when it comes to how they'll do in 2025?
Yeah, I briefly just got to mention the linebackers. I didn't talk about them. I know you highlighted them, but Weeks returning is a great player, 125 total tackles for him. And then Perkins and West Weeks, if they can both play at their full strength, they're really two talented players here. Perkins hopefully will try and get back to his form from previous years where he was really talented. This is a tough schedule, right? You highlighted there. They got some tough games here. I do think they benefit by playing some of their tougher SEC games at home. They get A&M at home. They get Florida at home. They get South Carolina at home, but a trip to Ole Miss, a trip to Tuscaloosa is never easy. Certainly a trip to Tuscaloosa is never easy. Then at Clemson, open things up. Clemson, they got a Dalton schedule too. Obviously, we'll highlight them at some point. That's a tough matchup, right? You play that game, probably going to be prime time. It gets very loud there in the Eastern Death Valley as opposed to the Western Death Valley, which LSU play in. Very tough spot. I think, the Florida game being early in the season is a little bit disappointing if you're an LSU fan because it's probably going to be during the day, probably a 3:30 time slot game there. You're hoping to get a night game maybe later in the year. I think it's a tough schedule, certainly, but a lot of SEC schedules are tough, right? I think when you look at most SEC schedules, they're very tough. Throwing in Clemson does make it that just a little bit harder here. And then you got to travel to Vanderbilt, too. They're no pushover anymore. They're not the kicking bag in the SEC that they used to be in Oklahoma at the end of the season and what is now kind of their rivalry game that they have added where they play Oklahoma during rivalry week. That's a tough matchup, too, right? You got to go travel out there. There's a team that's hoping to be strong with their new quarterback that they added. This is a team that has a really good roster. I question what Brian Kelly's been able to do, right? 10-4, 10-3, and 9-4 through three seasons so far. Can he finally get this team over the hump? They seem to struggle and they seem to blow games early on. I certainly wouldn't be shocked if they lose to Clemson during the first game of the season. It feels like Brian Kelly has a habit of losing his season opener, so it wouldn't shock me if they lose to Clemson. But if they can find a way to rattle off some wins after that, beat Ole Miss on the road and beat South Carolina in back-to-back weeks, that will put them in a really good situation for the college football playoffs, and that would afford them the ability to drop a game at Alabama or drop a game at Oklahoma if they pad those wins early in the season. You got to beat Florida early on. I think you got to beat Ole Miss early on if you fail at Clemson. Obviously, if you beat Clemson, that's a huge, probably the best non-conference win in the country early on, so that would be a really solid way to start off the season. This is a team that's got a good roster, good offensive line. I like the piece they added, good passer, and Nussmeier, who's really solid in the pocket. I worry about the defense, I worry about the secondary, and I worry about the run defense. I think there's some talented pieces on that run defense, but I just question if they're going to be able to hold up when they play those tougher teams in conference play. They're going to run the ball at you over and over again.
Yeah, they do have some good draws, though. A&M, South Carolina, Florida, all at home. And you noted some of those tough road games. LSU has not won a season opener since 2019. And here you go on the road at Clemson against what's probably going to be a top 10 team. So that trend might continue. What can LSU accomplish, though, if they can come out of the gates 1-0? I think they could really do some powerful things, quite frankly. I think for me, this team expectation CFP, and I think they'll eventually be in my 12-team CFP. Will I pick them to make a deeper run or win the conference? Won't figure that out for a couple of months deep into the summer, but I definitely think this team should eventually end up in the top 12. That's going to be it for today's episode. As always, Nick, appreciate you joining me breaking down the LSU Tigers here early on in this offseason and what an intriguing bunch it is.
Certainly a talented roster. Look forward to watching this team and looking forward to what Brian Kelly can do. Hopefully this team can reach the playoffs. High expectations, Baton Rouge. They've fallen a bit short the first couple of seasons, hoping to find some success in year 4.
Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.